Welcome to your channel, Silent Mind Studio, and thank you for listening to us. Today, we're diving deep, really deep, into something pretty fundamental. Religion. Where does it come from? How relevant is it now?
And we're not just spitballing here. We've got a whole stack of sources: history, linguistics, psychology, neuroscience, sociology, philosophy, you name it.
Right, so the idea is to unpack what these different fields tell us. We're exploring this, let's say, hypothesis that maybe religious beliefs, texts, the whole system, maybe it's fundamentally a human creation.
Exactly, shaped by, culture, our own psychology, social factors, rather than being purely divine revelation dropped from the sky.
It's a perspective that definitely shifts the lens,
Yeah.
looking at religion as a human phenomenon we can study.
Precisely. Using the tools of scholarship to figure out the how and the why behind its incredible influence across time and cultures.
Okay, so where do we start? The texts themselves seem like the logical place. The Bible, the Quran, the Torah.
Yeah, let's start there. Now, when scholars look at these texts, they use tools like literary criticism, history, linguistics. It's a different approach than reading purely for faith.
They're looking at how they were actually put together.
Right, how they were written, compiled, how they evolved over time.
Yeah.
And, well, what emerges is a much more complex picture than just a single divinely dictated document appearing fully formed. It's more layered.
And a big part of understanding that layering is this concept of intertextuality. Sounds academic, but the core idea is pretty simple, isn't it?
It really is. Basically, no text exists in a vacuum. Every piece of writing, every story is kind of in conversation with stuff that came before it, or stuff written around the same time.
Like echoes of older ideas showing up.
Exactly like echoes. You can think of it as weaving a new fabric, but using threads from older cloths. The meaning, the structure, even the words you choose are shaped by these influences, borrowings, maybe even arguments with other texts.
So researchers are looking for those echoes in religious texts, comparing them.
Precisely. They compare texts to find agreements, maybe spots where one seems to borrow from another, or how a later text might reinterpret or even react against an earlier one. It's all about mapping those intersections and overlaps.
That sounds tricky when dealing with texts considered sacred, divinely authored.
Oh, it is. And scholars tread carefully, focusing on methodology. But even with claims of sacred status, the tools of comparative study, influenced by things like structuralist criticism, get applied. So comparing, say, the Quran and the Bible isn't just about spotting similar stories like Noah's flood. It's about analyzing how those stories might have traveled, how they were adapted, maybe tweaked for a new theological purpose in the later text.
Interesting. So it highlights the human element in shaping the narrative.
That's the key implication. If you see these texts as deeply interwoven with older literary traditions, it really makes you question the idea of them being completely separate, unmediated divine revelations, untouched by human culture.
It suggests human hands were actively involved in compiling, editing, adapting.
Absolutely. It underscores that these scriptures are products of their specific historical moments, their literary contexts. They evolved within human culture rather than existing totally outside it.
That makes sense. It anchors them in history. Are there other ways scholars trace these connections beyond just comparing stories?
Yes, linguistics provides another really powerful lens. Studying things like loanwords, words borrowed from one language into another, and just general language contact, it lets us trace actual historical interactions.
So words traveling across borders tell a story.
They do. It's not just about trading pottery. It's about the exchange of complex ideas, beliefs, maybe even whole narratives.
Can you give us a solid example of that?
A really fascinating one is looking at Akkadian loanwords in biblical Hebrew. Akkadian was the language of Mesopotamia, think Babylon, Assyria, a huge cultural powerhouse in the ancient world.
Okay.
Finding Akkadian words embedded in the Hebrew Bible tells us there was significant Mesopotamian cultural and likely religious influence on the ancient Israelites.
Like specific words.
Yeah, for example, the Hebrew word kawan, used for a type of sacrificial cake in the book of Jeremiah, it's derived straight from the Akkadian kamano. That's not just borrowing a word. It suggests borrowing the practice itself.
Wow.
Another example, the Bible in Ezekiel mentions Mesopotamian deities like the Tammuz. This points to the integration, or at least awareness and interaction with, foreign religious elements within Israelite society. Maybe they were adopting some things, maybe pushing back against others.
So the language itself becomes a kind of archaeological record of cultural mixing.
In a way, yes. These linguistic fingerprints show that Israelite religion wasn't formed in a bubble. It was interacting with, borrowing from, adapting ideas from the dominant cultures around it, especially Mesopotamia. And that kind of cultural exchange and adaptation, that's completely normal in how cultures develop everywhere.
Okay, so texts referencing texts, languages showing contact. Let's talk about the big stories themselves. Comparative mythology must be where you see really clear narrative borrowing, right?
Absolutely. This is where you compare the myths, the legends, the epic tales across different cultures, especially in the ancient Near East. And when you do that, you find extensive parallels with stories that later appear in religious scriptures.
Parallels that suggest the scriptures were built on existing frameworks.
That's exactly the argument it substantiates. The ancient Near East Sumer, Mesopotamia, Canaan, Egypt, was this incredibly fertile ground for mythology, and its influence seems widespread.
Okay, let's get specific. Creation myths, how do they compare?
Well, if you look at Sumerian and Mesopotamian creation myths, which predate Genesis, you find common themes, like the idea of moving from primordial chaos to an ordered cosmos, or the divine creation of humans. In some Sumerian myths, for instance, humans are explicitly made from clay by the gods, often to do the hard labor the gods wanted to avoid. Now, that shares a structural similarity with Genesis, where humans are formed from the Adama, the earth, or clay.
But the purpose is different in Genesis, right? Stewardship versus labor.
Exactly. The theological framing, the purpose assigned to humanity, is quite different stewardship and relationship in Genesis versus just labor in those particular Mesopotamian myths. But the core narrative element, creation from earthy material by divine beings, shows a striking similarity in structure.
And the flood story, that parallel feels almost undeniable.
It's probably the most famous example, and for good reason. The Epic of Gilgamesh, a Mesopotamian text much older than the biblical account, has this incredibly detailed flood story.
Tell us about it.
You've got a divine council deciding to wipe out humanity with a flood. A chosen hero, Utnapishtim, is warned and told to build a massive boat, an ark. He saves his family, animals, craftsmen. The ark eventually lands on a mountain. He sends out birds to check for land. And then he offers a sacrifice, which the gods smell.
That sounds remarkably familiar.
It is. The parallels with the Noah story in Genesis are undeniable. There's another Mesopotamian text, the Etrahasis epic, with a similar flood narrative, too.
And the scholarly view is that these Mesopotamian stories came first.
The consensus is very strong on that point, yes. The Mesopotamian accounts predate the biblical one, likely by centuries. Some researchers even argue the whole flood motif makes more sense geohydrologically in Mesopotamia, with its river systems, than in ancient Palestine, further suggesting the story originated there and was later adopted.
But again, the theology is different. Monotheism versus polytheism.
Right. The reasons for the flood, the character of the divine, a single god in Genesis versus squabbling gods in Gilgamesh, the ultimate purpose, those aspects are reframed within the monotheistic worldview of the biblical authors. But the narrative scaffolding, it looks heavily borrowed.
Okay, so Mesopotamia was a huge influence. What about the Canaanites, the people living right next door to the Israelites?
Oh, definitely. Canaanite religion had a profound impact. We know about their polytheistic system from archaeology and also from references, often critical ones, within the Bible itself.
Who were their main gods?
Key figures included El, who was seen as the supreme father god, kind of the head honcho. Then there was Bel, a very important storm and fertility god, often depicted battling chaos. And Asherah, a major mother goddess figure, often considered El's consort.
And do we see echoes of these figures in how the Israelite god Yahweh is described?
We do. Some scholars suggest that attributes initially associated with El, like his supreme authority, were later transferred to Yahweh as Israelite monotheism developed. And Bel's role as the conqueror of chaotic forces, like the sea god Yam or the death god Mot, seems mirrored in biblical passages where Yahweh displays power over the sea or battles sea monsters like Leviathan.
What about Asherah? The Bible condemns worshiping her, but did Israelites actually do it?
The archaeological evidence is pretty compelling that, yes, many did. Inscriptions and figurines have been found at Israelite sites that mention Yahweh and Asherah together, suggesting she was worshipped, possibly even viewed by some as Yahweh's consort, mirroring that Canaanite El-Asherah pairing.
So the Bible is kind of pushing back against a popular practice.
It seems that way. The Bible itself documents periods where kings and common people worshipped Baal and Asherah alongside Yahweh sometimes. The prophetic condemnations show this wasn't a sealed-off religion. It was a complex interplay of borrowing, adapting, syncretizing, and rejecting elements from its immediate neighbors.
Okay, we've covered Mesopotamia and Canaan. What about mighty Egypt? Did their religion leave a mark?
Egypt was a huge power, no doubt, and there was plenty of contact. But direct literary borrowing from Egyptian religious texts into the Hebrew Bible seems, according to some scholars, perhaps less extensive than from Mesopotamia or Canaan. However, there are definitely parallels.
Where do those show up?
In certain types of literature, the parallels are quite striking. Egyptian wisdom literature, for example, like the Instruction of Amenemope, shares significant thematic and even structural similarities with parts of the biblical book of Proverbs, specifically Proverbs 22.17 to 24.22.
Interesting, like advice on living.
Exactly. And Egyptian hymns praising deities, like the famous Great Hymn to Aten from Akhenaten's time, have clear parallels with biblical songs praising God as creator, such as Psalm 104. Even the core concept of creation happening through the divine spoken word, which is so central to Genesis 1 and Psalm 33, has precedence in Egyptian creation myths.
Any other areas?
Yeah, scholars point to parallels in things like love poetry, comparing Egyptian love songs to the Song of Songs in the Bible. Also, some concepts related to judgment after death, and even descriptions of mythological creatures like Behemoth and Leviathan mentioned in the Book of Job, might have Egyptian resonances.
So maybe not direct copying of whole stories, but a shared cultural atmosphere. Ideas floating around.
That's often how it's interpreted. More like evidence of a shared cultural world, lots of contact, ideas circulating and being adapted, rather than necessarily sitting down and copying text verbatim.
Okay, let's jump forward in time. The New Testament. Christianity emerges in the Greco-Roman world. Was that environment also full of religious ideas that might show parallels?
Absolutely. The Greco-Roman world was religiously diverse and vibrant. Alongside the public state cults, you had numerous mystery religions or mystery cults.
What were those like?
These were typically voluntary associations. They involved secret initiation rites, promises of personal salvation or a better afterlife, and often centered on myths about gods who died and were reborn or resurrected in some way.
Can you name a few?
Sure. The Eleusinian mysteries focused on Demeter and Persephone were huge. Cults of Dionysus or Bacchus were widespread. You also had Orphism, and later the mysteries of Mithras became very popular, especially among soldiers.
And scholars see connections between these mysteries and early Christianity.
Yes, a lot of research is focused on this. They've identified significant parallels in concepts, terminology, and even some ritual forms.
Like what kind of concepts?
Core ideas like death and resurrection, redemption from sin or fate, spiritual regeneration or being born again, ritual purification often involving water, which echoes baptism, and sacred communal meals that brought initiates together, resonating with the early Christian Eucharist or Lord's Supper. Even the vocabulary used often overlapped. Terms like mystery itself, salvation, enlightenment, these were part of the common religious language of the Hellenistic world, used by both mystery cults and early Christians.
Can you give a specific example, like Paul's writings?
Sure. Paul talks about spiritual enlightenment, having the eyes of your heart enlightened to know God better in Ephesians. This language and concept shares ground with the Enlightenment initiates thought in mysteries like the Eleusinian rites. Some scholars argue that the way early Christians understood the saving significance, the soteriology of Jesus' death and resurrection, sometimes using language related to dying and rising fertility cycles, might have been influenced by, or at least expressed in terms familiar from, the mystery religion's dying and rising deity myths. Even Jesus is saying about a grain of wheat needing to die to bear fruit in John 12.24 is sometimes seen in this light.
What about rituals? Any similarities there?
There are formal similarities noted. Ritual washing or baptism, whether with water or sometimes blood in certain cults, like the Torbolium associated with Cybele, the sacred communal meals we mentioned, even practices like the veiling of women during worship, which Paul discusses regarding Corinth, have been compared to regulations in some Greek mystery cults. Narratives of divine figures undergoing a transfiguration or apotheosis in Hellenistic stories have been compared to the transfiguration of Christ account.
So how do scholars interpret all these parallels? Was it intentional borrowing by early Christians?
That's really the crux of the debate, and there isn't total agreement. Some argue, yes, early Christians likely did consciously adopt or adapt elements from the surrounding mystery religions. Why? To make their message more understandable, more appealing, more resonant to people living in that Greco-Roman cultural context.
Makes sense from a communication perspective.
Right. But others argue the similarities might be more superficial, or perhaps they arise independently from just being part of the same cultural soup, or from addressing similar fundamental human concerns about life, death, and meaning. They might just be common ways humans express religious ideas.
And how did early Christians themselves see these similarities?
That's interesting, too. Early Christian writers, known as apologists, like Justin Martyr in the 2nd century, definitely acknowledged the parallels. But they didn't see it as borrowing. They framed it negatively, arguing that the pagan mysteries were actually deliberate, demonic imitations created by Satan to mislead people away from the true faith in Christ before Christ even arrived.
Wow, a preemptive demonic counterfeit.
That was their explanation for the uncanny resemblances.
Okay, so let's try to pull this first part together. We've looked at intertextuality, language contact, comparative mythology across the Near East, Egypt, the Greco-Roman world. What's the big picture emerging from this deconstruction of sacred narratives?
The cumulative evidence from all these different angles points really strongly in one direction. Religious texts, even those held as uniquely sacred, don't seem to be isolated revelations that just appeared. They appear deeply embedded within and constructed from the cultural and literary materials that already existed around them.
So products of their time and place built with available materials.
Very much so. They look like products of cultural evolution, of syncretism, the mixing and merging of different traditions. Existing stories, themes, linguistic forms, ritual ideas seem to have been adopted, adapted, recontextualized, often for new theological or social purposes.
Like a kind of creative reuse on a grand scale.
You could think of it that way. And this perspective really challenges claims of absolute uniqueness or direct, unmediated divine authorship. It highlights the human creativity, the cultural dialogue, the historical processes involved in shaping these texts. Even seeing how ancient themes like battles with chaos monsters or dying and rising gods get transformed and reinterpreted within a monotheistic framework shows a sophisticated kind of human reauthorship at work.
Okay, that covers the content of the text. But what about their status? How did certain writings get elevated? How did they become scripture with a capital S or part of an official canon? That sounds like another very human process.
Oh, absolutely. It's crucial to distinguish these terms. A religious text is broad. Any writing important to a faith. Think guides, commentaries, histories.
But scripture is more specific.
Much more. Scripture is a subset. These are the texts a community comes to regard as especially authoritative, as holy writ, maybe divinely inspired, holding supreme authority. The word itself just comes from the Latin for writing, scriptura. But that authority isn't usually instant. It develops over time.
How does that happen?
Through generations of use, communal acceptance, maybe formal decisions by religious leaders or councils. It's ratified by the community. Believers might attribute it to divine inspiration, but the recognition and designation of a text as scripture is a human social process.
And didn't many of these start out as oral traditions anyway?
Many did, yes. Think of the Hindu Vedas, or early parts of the Bible, or the Quran itself being revealed orally first. They were passed down through memorization long before being reliably written down and compiled, and widespread distribution of written texts. That's really quite recent, historically speaking, post-printing press, mid-15th century. Before that, texts were rare and copied by hand.
Okay, so scripture is authoritative writing. What about canon?
Canon comes from the Greek word canon, which meant a measuring rod, a rule, or a standard. In a religious context, the canon is the official, closed list or catalog of texts that a specific faith community accepts as definitively authoritative, the ones that meet the rule of faith.
And deciding what was in or out of the canon wasn't simple, was it?
Far from it. Canonization was usually a really long, messy, complex historical process. It often involved intense debates, disagreements between different groups or sects. Texts were categorized, some accepted, some rejected, some considered useful but not fully canonical, like the deuterocanonical books or apocrypha in some Christian traditions.
So it reflected power struggles and theological disputes.
Often, yes. It was about defining orthodoxy, drawing boundaries, deciding which texts represented the core beliefs and which represented interpretations or groups they wanted to exclude. The earliest explicit reference we have to the idea of a fixed scriptural canon in Christianity, for example, doesn't appear until the 4th century CE, centuries after the texts themselves were written.
And this whole idea of a fixed canon isn't universal across all religions.
Not at all. It's very characteristic of the Abrahamic faiths, Judaism, Christianity, Islam, though even within them, there are variations. As mentioned, different Christian denominations have slightly different Old Testament canons. In Islam, the Quran's status is universal among Muslims, but the canonicity and authority of different hadith collections, sayings and actions of Muhammad, vary significantly between Sunni and Shia branches, for instance. And traditions like Hinduism and Buddhism historically had a much more open and fluid concept of sacred texts without a single definitive closed canon in the same way.
So The big implication here is that even the process of defining what counts as holy scripture is deeply shaped by human history and community decisions.
Exactly. The selection process, the debates, the eventual consensus or lack thereof, it all highlights the human element. Elevating certain texts to supreme authority wasn't just a divine decree falling from the sky. It was shaped by human agency, historical events, theological arguments, and the social and political needs of religious communities over time.
Okay, that's a lot to think about regarding the texts themselves. If you are interested in content like this, we will discuss a topic that has intrigued us every day. Subscribe to the channel and follow us.
And definitely, if you have a question about this or anything else related to our discussion today, drop it in the comments below. We do try to engage with those.
All right, let's shift gears now. We've looked at the texts as potentially human constructs. What about the human mind? Why are we seemingly so receptive to religious ideas? Why is belief so persistent across cultures? This takes us into psychology, neuroscience.
Right. This is where science explores whether our capacity for religion is, somehow wired into us, maybe even shaped by our evolutionary past. It's looking for naturalistic explanations for why humans are so prone to thinking in religious ways.
Which brings us to the evolutionary psychology of religion. What's the main idea there?
Evolutionary psychology tries to understand why we have certain cognitive traits and behaviors, including religious ones, by thinking about what advantage they might have given our ancestors in terms of survival and reproduction.
Okay.
There's a general agreement that the propensity for religious behavior probably evolved quite early in human history. The big debate is how it was adaptive. Was it directly selected for, or was it more of a side effect?
Let's take the first idea, religion as a direct adaptation. What would that mean?
It means that religious beliefs and practices themselves were favored by natural selection because they gave individuals or groups some kind of survival or reproductive edge. This is despite the fact that religious practices are often costly. They take time, energy, resources, sometimes involve risks or pain.
So the benefits must have outweighed the costs.
That's the logic. And a major theory here revolves around social solidarity. Researchers like Richard Sosis and Candace Alcorta argue that religion was incredibly effective at promoting cooperation, cohesion, and coordination within groups.
How would that help survival?
Well, groups that cooperate better are more successful at things like mutual defense, sharing food, enforcing rules that benefit everyone, raising children collectively. Stronger group cohesion means a better chance of surviving and passing on genes.
Is there evidence for this cooperation link?
There is. Richard Sosis did this fascinating study on 19th century American utopian communes. He found that the religious communes, especially those that demanded really costly signals of commitment from their members like strict dietary laws, specific dress codes, communal labor, giving up personal property, tended to last significantly longer than the secular communes.
Why would costly demands make them last longer?
The idea is that these costly signals are hard to fake. They weed out the free riders, people who might want the benefits of the group without being truly committed. If you're willing to undergo difficult rituals or follow strict rules, it signals your genuine commitment to the group and its beliefs, fostering trust and cooperation. This ties into costly signaling theory.
So tough rituals build stronger groups.
That seems to be the function, yes. Cross-cultural studies have also found, for instance, that societies facing frequent warfare tend to have the most arduous and painful male initiation rites. This suggests a link between the need for high-stakes cooperation, like in warfare, and the intensity of these religious signals of commitment. Social psychologist Jonathan Haidt often points to this research as evidence that religion might be an evolved solution to the problem of cooperation, especially among larger groups of non-relatives.
Okay, so that's religion as a direct adaptation for group cohesion. What's the alternative evolutionary explanation? Religion as a byproduct.
Right, the byproduct or spandrel view. This suggests religion wasn't directly selected for its own sake, but emerged as an unintended consequence of other cognitive abilities that were adaptive for different reasons.
Like what kind of abilities?
Well, some thinkers, like the late Stephen Jay Gould, propose that the evolution of our big, complex brains, which gave us language, tool use, planning, also inevitably led to things like self-awareness, consciousness of our own mortality. And maybe religion arose as a way to cope with those existentially troubling side effects.
Makes sense.
More specific byproduct theories focus on particular cognitive mechanisms. Pascal Boyer and Scott Atran, for example, argue that religious beliefs piggyback on several ordinary cognitive tools that evolve for other purposes.
Such as?
One key one is our tendency for agent detection. We're highly attuned to spotting agents, things that act with intention in our environment. Big predators, prey, other humans. Justin Barrett calls this the hyperactive agency detection device, or HADD. Yeah, because it's biased to overdetect agency. It's safer to mistakenly think a swaying branch is a lurking predator than to miss a real predator. This hypersensitivity, the theory goes, makes us prone to attributing intention and agency to ambiguous stimuli, seeing faces in clouds, feeling a presence in an empty room, attributing storms or diseases to angry spirits. This could form the cognitive basis for believing in unseen, intentional, supernatural agents like gods or spirits.
Okay, so HADD is one piece. What else?
Our drive for causal reasoning is another. We constantly seek explanations for events. We build narratives to make sense of the world. Why did the crops fail? Why did lightning strike that tree? Attributing it to an unseen agent provides a causal story. In our theory of mind, our ability to understand that others have minds, beliefs, intentions, desires, which is crucial for social interaction, can also be applied to these inferred agents. We start thinking about what the gods want, what their intentions are. So these basic cognitive tools, useful for everyday survival and social life, might inadvertently generate belief in supernatural agents.
And Boyer's idea about minimally counterintuitive concepts fits in here too.
Yes, that's a really important part of the byproduct explanation for why certain religious ideas stick around. Boyer argues the concepts that are just slightly weird or counterintuitive are the most memorable and easily transmitted culturally.
Why minimally? Why not totally bizarre?
Because if something is too bizarre, too far outside our normal understanding of how things work, it's hard to process, hard to remember, hard to relate to. But if it's mostly familiar, with just one or two violations of intuitive expectation, like a talking snake, an invisible person, a statue that bleeds it, grabs our attention. Because it's odd, but it's still grounded enough in our basic understanding. It's still a snake, a person, a statue, to be easily recalled and passed on.
So a god who is like a human but all-powerful and immortal is MCI.
Exactly. It fits our person category, but violates a couple of expectations: omnipotence, immortality. Boyer suggests these MCI concepts have an optimal blend of attention-grabbing weirdness and cognitive ease, making them culturally successful. Really abstract theological concepts like a god who is simultaneously three persons or completely outside time might be too counterintuitive to spread easily without a lot of cultural scaffolding and formal teaching.
So evolutionary psychology provides these frameworks suggesting our brains are kind of preset to find religious-like thinking easy, and certain types of supernatural ideas are naturally catchy.
That's the core idea. It offers a naturalistic grounding for religion in our evolved cognitive architecture, rather than seeing it purely as something learned or revealed from outside.
This leads perfectly into the cognitive science of religion, or CSR. How does CSR take these ideas further?
CSR uses methods from experimental psychology, anthropology, linguistics, history. It's very interdisciplinary to empirically investigate these cognitive underpinnings of religious belief. A central idea in CSR, building on evolutionary psychology, is that many common religious beliefs are cognitively natural.
There's that phrase again. What does cognitively natural mean in practice?
It means these beliefs are easy for the human mind to acquire, process, and transmit. They seem to resonate with our default ways of thinking. Things like belief in an afterlife, in souls or minds that are separate from bodies, in invisible agents with intentions, gods, spirits, or in miracles. These sorts of beliefs tend to pop up across cultures, often emerge quite early in childhood, even without much explicit teaching, and seem relatively easy for people to grasp intuitively.
So our brains are just sort of susceptible to these ideas.
That's the implication. For example, our intuitive mind-body dualism, the feeling that our mind or consciousness is somehow separate from our physical brain and body, makes the idea of a soul surviving death feel quite natural, even if it contradicts biological reality. And Boyer's NCI concepts are also a key part of the CSR explanation for the cultural success of many supernatural beliefs.
CSR also makes a distinction between folk religion and theology, right?
Yes, that's an important distinction. Folk religion refers to the more intuitive, spontaneous, often anthropomorphic supernatural beliefs that seem to arise fairly naturally from our everyday cognitive processes like thinking God gets angry or needs reminding. Theology, on the other hand, refers to the more systematic, abstract, reflective doctrines developed by religious specialists. These often require formal education, conscious effort, and specific cultural transmission to learn and maintain, and they sometimes contradict our more intuitive folk beliefs.
So theology is less natural in this cognitive sense.
Generally, yes. It's seen as more culturally constructed, more unnatural, in that it often requires overriding our intuitive defaults. This distinction echoes philosophers like David Hume, who noted the gap between the abstract arguments of theologians, the more concrete, human-like gods of popular belief.
But you mentioned even theology isn't totally separate from our cognitive biases.
Correct. Even highly abstract theology isn't immune. Underlying cognitive tendencies still play a role. For instance, our intuitive teleology, the bias towards seeing purpose and design in everything, can make theological arguments from design feel very persuasive, even if they face philosophical challenges. Confirmation bias, coherence seeking, these general cognitive processes also shape how theological ideas are developed, transmitted, and accepted. So there's a continuity.
And this idea of theological incorrectness, that really highlights the pull of intuitive thinking.
It does. It's the finding that even people who sincerely profess belief in complex, abstract theological doctrines often revert to more intuitive, anthropomorphic ways of thinking about God or spirits in their spontaneous reasoning or everyday interactions. Someone might believe intellectually that God is omniscient and knows everything simultaneously, but then find themselves praying as if they need to catch God's attention or explain the situation, betraying an intuitive model of God having limited attention like a human. It shows how powerful these underlying cognitive defaults are.
So CSR paints a picture of the human mind as being naturally predisposed towards religious-like thinking, making religion a very human phenomenon.
Precisely. It suggests the foundations of religious belief aren't solely external, like divine revelation, or purely arbitrary cultural inventions, but are significantly shaped by the very way our minds work.
Which logically leads us to look inside the brain itself. Neuroscience of religion, what's happening neurologically during these experiences.
Neuroscience tries to identify the neural correlates of religious belief and experience. Using tools like fMRI or EEG, researchers look at brain activity patterns during prayer, meditation, mystical experiences, or when people contemplate religious concepts.
And what have they found? Is there a God spot in the brain?
No, the idea of a single God spot is widely considered too simplistic and not supported by the evidence. Religious experience is complex and involves various brain networks. Studies on meditation, for example, often show increased activity in frontal lobe areas associated with attention and executive control, and sometimes decreased activity in parietal lobe areas involved in spatial orientation and the sense of self, which might correlate with reported feelings of oneness or boundary dissolution. Studies on people speaking in tongues, glossolalia, show distinct patterns of brain activity compared to normal speech, often involving reduced activity in frontal language areas. Prayer, especially spontaneous, personal prayer, seems to activate brain regions associated with social cognition and theory of mind areas we use when thinking about or interacting with other people. So different practices engage different neural circuits.
Is religiosity linked to our genes at all?
Twin studies suggest there's a heritable component. Not specific religion genes, but genetic factors seem to influence personality traits like openness to experience or agreeableness or cognitive styles, which in turn can make individuals more or less inclined towards religious belief or certain types of spiritual experiences like self-transcendence.
What about links to brain disorders or injuries? Can they shed light?
Sometimes. For example, some individuals with temporal lobe epilepsy report experiencing intense feelings of religious awe, ecstasy, or sensing a divine presence, particularly associated with seizures originating in that brain region. This led to early speculation about the temporal lobes being key, but again, it's likely more complex. Limbic structures involved in emotion and significance processing probably play a role in tagging certain experiences as profoundly meaningful, which are then interpreted through a person's cultural or religious lens. Religious delusions can also be a symptom of psychiatric conditions like schizophrenia, and some neurological conditions like Parkinson's disease, which affects dopamine pathways involved in motivation, have been associated with decreases in reported religiosity.
There is also that hypothesis linking religious experience to self-transformation and REM sleep.
Yes, Patrick McNamara's hypothesis. He proposes that religious experiences might serve an adaptive function by providing cognitive tools for profound self-transformation. This allows individuals to radically shift their ingrained behaviors and perspectives, which could be crucial for adapting to major life changes or crises. He suggests this involves a process of decentering, or temporarily suspending the ordinary sense of self.
And the REM sleep connection.
McNamara speculates that these decentering processes might tap into mechanisms related to REM sleep, which is known to be involved in emotional regulation and memory consolidation. He points to the timing of genetic changes related to REM sleep regulation, coinciding with archaeological evidence for early shamanic practices in the Upper Paleolithic, suggesting a possible coevolutionary link where religious experiences co-opted REM-related mechanisms to facilitate identity restructuring. It's a fascinating, though still speculative, hypothesis.
So, neuroscience grounds these experiences in brain function, evolutionary processes, maybe even our sleep cycles.
Exactly. It provides naturalistic explanations, showing how deeply intertwined religious phenomena are with our human biology and neurology.
Okay, one more field in this section. Sociobiology. How does it approach religion?
Sociobiology, closely linked to evolutionary psychology, looks at the biological basis of social behavior, often focusing on how behaviors might contribute to the survival and replication of genes, genetic fitness. From this perspective, religion is analyzed for its potential contributions to these evolutionary goals.
And E.O. Wilson's idea of a mythopoeic drive.
Yes, Wilson, a pioneer of sociobiology, talked about a fundamental human tendency to create myths, narratives, and religious systems, a mythopoeic drive. He saw this as a defining human trait, often reinforced by intense emotional or physiological experiences people interpret as transcendental. These myths help us organize our world, understand our place in it, and structure social life. Alexander Morin built on this, suggesting that all complex organisms need decision-making systems for a chaotic world, and in humans, this manifests partly through religions and cosmologies that define self, other, and interaction rules.
So, sociobiology sees the root of religion in our biology, our genes.
Ultimately, yes. The argument is that the propensity for religious behavior itself, not the specific content, which varies culturally, stems from our genetic makeup, because it somehow, perhaps indirectly, facilitated the survival and replication of the genes underlying that propensity, maybe through enhancing group cohesion, as we discussed. In this view, religion is seen, in Wilson's rather stark terms, as potentially a blind and accidental result of random variation. Specific concepts like God or detailed doctrines are seen as cultural inventions, likely built upon or facilitated by these deeper biological predispositions.
Which means sociobiology inherently treats religious truth claims as secondary to its biological function.
Precisely. It denies intrinsic metaphysical truth to religious claims, and instead analyzes religion as a product of evolutionary forces, subject to historical and biological analysis. The focus is squarely on how beliefs and behaviors, true or not, contributed to reproductive success or group survival in the past.
So, wrapping up this whole section on the human mind and belief, it seems like all these different fields, evolutionary psychology, CSR, neuroscience, sociobiology, converge on the idea that humans have a deep-seated natural predisposition towards religious-like thinking and behavior.
That's a fair summary. They point towards religion not being some alien imposition, but something that emerges quite naturally from our evolved cognitive, emotional, and social architecture. It makes religion natural for humans, in a sense.
But, and this is the crucial point we keep coming back to, does that naturalness automatically validate the supernatural claims?
No, it doesn't. And the CSR distinction between intuitive folk religion and effortful theology is important here. Basic supernatural concepts might arise easily, but complex doctrines require significant cultural support. More importantly, the adaptive advantages like group cohesion relate to the function of belief, not its objective truth.
Right, a belief can be useful even if it's false.
Exactly. A belief system can foster cooperation and stability within a group, providing a clear adaptive benefit, even if its core tenets about gods or the afterlife are factually incorrect. The belief itself and the behaviors it motivates can provide the evolutionary edge, regardless of the ontological status of the deities involved.
If you are interested in content like this, we will discuss a topic that has intrigued us every day. Subscribe to the channel and follow us.
And as always, if you have questions or thoughts sparked by this discussion, please share them in the comment section. We value hearing from you.
Okay, we've explored the text as human creations and the mind as being predisposed to belief. Now let's get down to the brass tacks, the factual claims. How do religious assertions about the natural world, about history, about future events hold up against empirical science and historical investigation?
This is where we really put the empirical content of religious systems under the microscope. We compare their specific claims to establish scientific knowledge and historical findings, and we also need to think about why beliefs sometimes persist even when they seem contradicted by evidence.
It seems obvious that science and religion often have different methods for finding truth. That must be where the conflict starts.
Absolutely. They operate with fundamentally different approaches to knowledge, different epistemologies. Science relies on empirical evidence, observation, experimentation, making claims that are testable and potentially falsifiable. It works within methodological naturalism, meaning it only considers natural explanations for natural phenomena. Supernatural explanations are, by definition, outside its scope. And scientific knowledge is always provisional, open to revision. Religion, on the other hand, often draws knowledge from revelation, sacred text, tradition, authority, personal faith, intuition. Many core religious beliefs concern the supernatural and aren't easily testable empirically. So when religious texts make claims that do touch on the empirical realm, cosmology, biology, history, and we examine those claims scientifically, they generally don't align with modern scientific understanding. They don't typically contain scientific knowledge beyond what was known at the time, nor do they make accurate predictions in a scientific sense.
But what about those claims you sometimes hear about scientific foreknowledge in scriptures? The idea that, say, the Quran or the Bible contains scientific facts discovered only centuries later.
Yes, that line of argument, sometimes called Bukhayism, after a proponent regarding the Quran, it's been extensively critiqued by scholars and scientists.
What are the main criticisms?
Well, first, the alleged scientific facts are almost always identified after the scientific discovery has been made. It's hindsight bias. Second, it usually involves taking verses out of their original context, ignoring the historical setting, the surrounding verses, traditional interpretations, and reinterpreting ambiguous or poetic language to force-fit it to modern science.
So it's reading modern science into the text, not finding it there originally.
Exactly. Critics call this eisegesis, reading in, rather than exegesis, drawing out meaning from context. Often, the passages cited are vague, metaphorical, or just describe common observations or beliefs of the time, like water being essential for life, or mountains being big and seemingly permanent. These aren't precise scientific statements anticipating modern geology or biology. Claiming divine origin based on these post hoc reinterpretations is logically shaky. Fundamentally, these texts weren't written as science textbooks. They don't make novel, testable predictions about the natural world. Prophecies within them are typically about moral judgment or historical events in relation to divine covenants, not about predicting future scientific discoveries.
Okay, setting aside debatable foreknowledge claims, what about straightforward scientific or historical inaccuracies found in these texts when read literally?
When you compare literal interpretations of claims about cosmology, biology, geology, or history in scriptures with established science and history, you find numerous discrepancies.
Let's start with cosmology. That seems like a big area of conflict historically.
It is. The classic example is the clash over geocentrism, Earth-centered universe, versus heliocentrism, sun-centered. The Church, basing its view partly on literal scriptural interpretations that seem to imply a stationary Earth, famously opposed Copernicus and Galileo. It shows the tension between scientific observation and dogma based on ancient texts.
And the shape of the Earth. Flat Earth ideas.
Many ancient cultures, including those that produce the biblical texts, conceived of a flat, disc-like Earth covered by a solid dome or firmament. Some Quranic descriptions of the Earth being spread out like a carpet are also often interpreted as reflecting this ancient cosmology. Early Christian figures like Cosmas Indicopleustes explicitly argued for a flat Earth based on the Bible, rejecting the spherical Earth known to the ancient Greeks centuries earlier. These ancient cosmologies are just fundamentally incompatible with modern astronomy.
What about the creation stories themselves? Genesis, for instance.
Well, Genesis 1 and 2 offers somewhat different creation sequences, which is an internal inconsistency. More broadly, the time scale, a few thousand years versus 13.8 billion, the order of events, Earth before sun stars in Genesis versus science, and the mechanism, divine fiat versus gradual evolution over billions of years, directly contradict scientific consensus in cosmology, geology, and biology. Quranic accounts also present sequences, like Earth before stars, that conflict with scientific findings.
And the idea of a solid sky, the firmament.
Both the Bible and the Quran describe the sky as a solid structure, a firmament, a ceiling, a canopy that holds back water or could even fall. That reflects ancient Near Eastern cosmology, completely at odds with our understanding of the atmosphere and space.
Moving to biology, are there specific examples of inaccuracies?
Sure. Leviticus 11 classifies certain flying insects as having 4 legs, when insects have 6. In Matthew 13, Jesus is quoted saying the mustard seed is the smallest of all seeds, which isn't botanically true. Orchid seeds, for example, are much smaller. The Quran, 16.66, describes milk production in cattle as coming from between excretions and blood, which misrepresents the function of mammary glands. Another Quranic passage, 86.5-7, states human semen originates from between the backbone and the ribs, contradicting modern anatomical knowledge of the testes. These reflect the biological understanding of their time, not modern science.
And geological claims. You mentioned mountains earlier.
Yes, the Quran, example 16.15, 78.6-7, asserts mountains act as pegs or stabilizers to prevent the earth from shaking. Modern geology shows mountains are formed by tectonic plate movements, the very processes that cause earthquakes. Mountains are often signs of geological instability, not stability.
What about historical claims, things the texts say happened in the past?
Here, too, archaeology and historical research raise questions. For the Hebrew Bible, the historicity or scale of events like Noah's global flood, details of the exodus from Egypt, where corroborating Egyptian evidence is lacking, the story of Queen Esther, or certain chronological details in Daniel, like Belshazzar being king of Babylon when historical records show he was regent, or the figure of Darius the Mede, are debated or contradicted by external evidence. For the New Testament, historians question the feasibility and lack of corroboration for the Roman census described in Luke's nativity account. The massacre of the innocents described in Matthew isn't mentioned by contemporary historians like Josephus, who documented other atrocities by Herod. The claim of 3 hours of darkness covering the land during the crucifixion, Matthew 27.45, lacks confirmation from Roman or other historians who recorded astronomical events.
Are there also internal contradictions or prophecies within the Bible that critics point to?
Yes. Critics highlight numerous internal inconsistencies. Differing genealogies for Jesus in Matthew and Luke, conflicting details and accounts of the same events, like the number of animals on Noah's Ark or resurrection appearances, seemingly contradictory divine commands or statements. They also point to prophecies that appear unfulfilled based on the Bible's own criterion in Deuteronomy 18.22. If a prophecy doesn't happen, it wasn't from God.
Such as?
Examples often cited include God's warning to Adam and Eve that they would die on the day they ate the fruit. They lived for centuries after. Prophecies of Solomon's eternal riches or David's descendants having an eternal throne. Isaiah's prediction of Damascus becoming a permanent ruin. It's one of the oldest continuously inhabited cities. Jeremiah's precise 70-year Babylonian captivity. And Jesus' own statements in the Gospels suggesting the end of the world and his return would happen within the lifetime of his immediate followers. For a G, Matthew 16.28, Mark 13.30.
So, across cosmology, biology, geology, history, internal consistency, there seems to be a consistent pattern of conflict when comparing literal scriptural claims with external evidence.
That's what the analysis suggests. It underscores this tension between knowledge based on adherence to ancient texts and knowledge derived from empirical investigation. As science advances, literalist interpretations become increasingly untenable. The empirical claims in these texts generally reflect the worldview and understanding of the time they were written, not timeless scientific or historical truth. The very need for elaborate reinterpretation to make them fit modern science implicitly admits the original plain sense was scientifically flawed.
Which brings us back to the question, if the scientific and historical evidence contradicts these literal claims so strongly, why do so many people continue to hold these beliefs? Beliefs like a young Earth or denial of evolution?
That's a really important question, and the answers lie in psychology, sociology, and epistemology. The persistence of scientifically refuted beliefs is a complex phenomenon. Often, it's sustained by belief systems that explicitly prioritize faith, revelation, or the authority of the sacred text over empirical evidence when the two conflict. Some religious viewpoints, like one expressed on Shabbat.org, for instance, state the Torah contains absolute truths, while science offers only theory hypotheses. When there's a clash, the revealed truth takes precedence, and science is seen as incomplete or mistaken. This can lead people to reinterpret science to fit Scripture, or to compartmentalize keeping faith and reason in separate boxes.
It sounds like a strategy to avoid cognitive dissonance, that uncomfortable feeling when your beliefs clash with evidence.
Exactly. Apologetics, including those scientific foreknowledge arguments we discussed, can be seen partly as attempts to reduce that dissonance. If you can convince yourself the ancient text somehow anticipated modern science, it resolves the conflict and reinforces the text's perceived authority. But as we noted, these interpretations often lack solid historical or linguistic grounding and function more as belief defense mechanisms.
Are there other factors keeping these beliefs alive?
Definitely. Cultural identity is huge. If believing certain things is central to belonging to your community, questioning those beliefs means risking social isolation. Early indoctrination plays a role. Beliefs learned in childhood are deeply ingrained. Trust is another factor. People may trust their religious leaders or community more than scientists or secular authorities. And basic cognitive biases, like confirmation bias, seeking out evidence that confirms what you already believe, and motivated reasoning, interpreting evidence in a way that supports your desired conclusion, make it hard to objectively evaluate challenging information. So simply presenting contradictory evidence often isn't enough to change deeply held identity-linked beliefs. They are remarkably resilient.
If you are interested in content like this, we will discuss a topic that has intrigued us every day. Subscribe to the channel and follow us.
And please, if any of this sparks questions or you have a different perspective based on the evidence, share it in the comments. Dialogue is always helpful.
Okay, we've tackled the texts, the mind, and the empirical claims. Now for the really big metaphysical questions. God, the soul, an afterlife, divine purpose. How do these core religious ideas hold up when examined through scientific and philosophical lenses? And what does that mean for religion's place in the modern world?
Right. This is where we engage with the non-empirical core of many religions. Science, by its nature, can't directly disprove a non-empirical God or soul. It deals with the natural world. However, scientific findings can challenge the necessity or plausibility of certain supernatural claims, and philosophy provides tools to analyze their logical coherence.
So how does science challenge these metaphysical ideas, even indirectly?
Mostly by providing robust, naturalistic explanations for phenomena previously attributed to the supernatural. Cosmology, for example, gives us the Big Bang model, explaining the universe's origin and evolution over 13.8 billion years without requiring divine intervention. While some point to the fine-tuning of physical constants as evidence for a designer, physics also offers alternative explanations like the anthropic principle within a multiverse framework, suggesting we simply observe the conditions necessary for our existence. These scientific models directly challenge traditional creation stories.
And neuroscience challenges the idea of a soul.
Significantly. The overwhelming evidence from neuroscience shows that consciousness, personality, memory, emotion, everything we associate with the self or soul is dependent on the physical brain. Brain injury changes personality, brain chemistry alters experience, thoughts correlate with neural activity. This makes the concept of an immaterial soul that exists independently of the body and survives death scientifically problematic. If mind is what the brain does, what's left when the brain ceases to function? Neuroscience also probes decision-making, raising questions about libertarian free will, a concept often crucial for religious ideas of sin and salvation.
What about evolution and the problem of evil?
Evolutionary biology explains human origins through natural selection, contradicting literal special creation narratives. It also highlights the vast amount of suffering inherent in the natural world: disease, predation, natural disasters, genetic defects. This natural evil, alongside human-caused suffering, moral evil, poses the classic philosophical problem of evil. How can an all-powerful, all-knowing, all-good God coexist with such widespread, seemingly gratuitous suffering? Science reveals the mechanisms of this suffering, making it harder to dismiss.
And anthropology by showing the diversity of beliefs.
Exactly. Anthropology documents the incredible variety of creation myths, moral codes, afterlife beliefs across cultures. This strongly suggests that specific religious narratives are products of human culture and imagination, tailored to local needs and contexts, rather than reflecting universal divine truths. The sheer diversity undermines claims of exclusivity made by many religions.
So the cumulative impact of science is to shrink the space where supernatural explanations seem necessary.
That's the trend. As science provides more comprehensive naturalistic explanations for the universe, life, and consciousness, the explanatory gap for the supernatural seems to diminish. While science doesn't disprove God, its success makes invoking supernatural causes less necessary and less parsimonious.
And this tension comes back to the different ways science and religion approach knowledge, their epistemologies.
Fundamentally, yes. Science relies on methodological naturalism seeking natural causes. This isn't necessarily a claim that nothing supernatural exists, that's ontological naturalism, but it's a procedural rule for doing science. However, the consistent success of methodological naturalism provides strong inductive support for metaphysical naturalism. If natural explanations keep working, why postulate the supernatural? It violates Occam's razor: don't multiply entities unnecessarily.
So science reaches its limit with a non-empirical God. That's where philosophy steps in.
Precisely. Science can't put a non-interacting, non-empirical God to the test, but philosophy can evaluate the concept of God for logical consistency, coherence, and plausibility.
What are some key philosophical arguments against the existence of God, or for agnosticism?
Well, there's the argument from insufficient evidence the burden of proof lies with those claiming God exists. And many philosophers argue the evidence offered, classical arguments, scripture, experience, isn't strong enough. The problem of evil, as mentioned, is a major one, arguing that suffering makes the existence of a traditional benevolent God improbable or logically impossible. The problem of divine hiddenness asks why a loving God who desires belief wouldn't make his existence more obvious, suggesting the prevalence of reasonable non-belief counts against such God. Other arguments focus on the potential incoherence of divine attributes, like paradoxes of omnipotence or conflicts between omniscience and free will, or justice and mercy. If the concept itself is logically flawed, such a being can't exist. And then there's the argument from parsimony again. If naturalistic explanations work, the God hypothesis is an unnecessary addition. Agnosticism, in its various forms, concludes that knowledge about God's existence is simply unattainable for humans.
Of course, theistic philosophers have responses to all these arguments.
Absolutely. The debate is rich and ongoing. Theists offer solutions to the problem of evil, like free will defenses or greater good arguments, counter-arguments on divine hiddenness, defenses of divine attributes, and positive arguments for God's existence, like refined cosmological, teleological, or moral arguments. Thinkers like Alvin Plantinga argue belief in God can be properly basic, not requiring inferential evidence, much like belief in the external world or other minds.
So philosophy challenges the logical and moral coherence of theism, even where science can't tread.
Yes, it shifts the focus from empirical proof to conceptual analysis, consistency, and plausibility. Even if God is beyond science, the idea of God as presented in specific religious traditions is open to rigorous philosophical critique.
Okay, let's bring us back to the societal level. Historically, religion was obviously central to law, ethics, social structure.
Undeniably. For most of history, religion provided the framework for social organization, law, governance. Think of ancient law codes invoking divine authority, the development of religious legal systems like Sharia, the influence of Christian thought on Western law. Religious values shaped concepts of justice, morality, and social order.
And sociologists offered different interpretations of this role.
Right. Durkheim saw religion as vital for social cohesion, creating shared identity and reinforcing norms, the social cement. Weber saw it as a potential engine for social change, linking Protestantism to capitalism. Marx saw it critically as an opiate masking oppression and hindering social progress. Religion has also been fundamental to identity, giving people meaning, belonging, and a way to understand their place in the cosmos.
But in many modern societies, we see a shift toward secular ethics. Religion's direct hold on law seems weaker.
That's a clear trend in many parts of the world, especially modernized nations. Secular ethics, moral frameworks based on human reason, empathy, science, consequences rather than divine command, have gained prominence. Secular humanism, for example, argues we can be good without God, deriving ethics from considerations of human well-being, justice, and autonomy.
Which leads to that big question. Can societies function well, ethically, without widespread religious belief?
It's a crucial question for our time. Proponents of secular morality argue it can be more adaptable and universal than religiously based ethics, evolving with our understanding. Evolutionary perspectives suggest core moral intuitions like fairness and harm avoidance predate religion anyway. And historically, the prejudice that non-believers must be immoral is being challenged by the reality of ethical atheists and secularists. Research also suggests that the positive social outcomes linked to religion, like well-being or prosociality, might actually stem from non-religious factors like strong social connections, having a clear worldview, which could be secular, or simply fitting in culturally. Participating in secular community groups can provide similar benefits to religious involvement.
And we have real-world examples of highly secular societies that function very well.
Exactly. The Scandinavian countries are the prime example. They consistently rank highest in the world on measures of well-being, social trust, equality, low crime, despite being among the least religious nations. Their success relies on strong social safety nets, education, trust, and humanistic values, not religious dogma. Other secular countries like the Czech Republic or Estonia also function effectively. These cases empirically challenge the notion that religion is necessary for a prosperous, ethical, and cohesive society.
Social contract theory also offers a secular basis for political order.
Right. Philosophers like Hobbes, Locke, Rousseau argue that legitimate political authority arises from the consent of the governed based on reason and mutual benefit, not divine right. Modern secular states ground their legitimacy in democratic processes, human rights, and legal systems reflecting shared human values.
So this shift towards secularism is part of a larger societal evolution.
It seems to be linked to individualism, rationalism, science, pluralism. It doesn't mean religion disappears or becomes unimportant personally or culturally, but its role as the indispensable foundation for public morality and governance is being questioned and, in many places, replaced. The evidence suggests societies can thrive based on secular humanistic principles. And fundamentally, morality itself appears rooted in our evolved human capacity for empathy, cooperation, and reason. Religions often codified and reinforced these, but likely didn't invent them. The fact that many religious people today use modern ethical reasoning to interpret or even reject problematic parts of their own scriptures shows that our moral compass is often guided by broader human values.
If you are interested in content like this, we will discuss a topic that has intrigued us every day. Subscribe to the channel and follow us.
And one last reminder, if today's deep dive raised questions or you want to share your thoughts, the comment section is the place to do it.
Wow, we have covered a huge amount of ground today, pulling together threads from ancient history, linguistics, psychology, neuroscience, philosophy, sociology, trying to get a handle on the origins and relevance of religious systems. Bringing it all together, what's the final takeaway?
Well, when you synthesize all this evidence, the conclusion that emerges quite strongly is that religions, as complex systems of belief, narrative, and practice, appear to be predominantly human creations.
Explain that a bit more.
We saw how the narratives often borrow heavily from older myths, how the doctrine seems shaped by our cognitive biases and psychological needs, how their survival depends on cultural transmission and social reinforcement. Even the selection of which texts become sacred is a human historical process. It points away from simple divine revelation and towards a complex human story.
And this perspective inevitably changes how we view their relevance today, especially with the rise of science.
It does. Science offers powerful, naturalistic explanations for the universe and life, directly challenging many traditional religious claims about cosmology, biology, and history. The explanatory power of religion regarding the natural world has significantly diminished. Where scientifically refuted beliefs persist, it often seems due to factors like faith-based epistemology, community identity, or apologetics that don't stand up well to neutral scrutiny, rather than the strength of the evidence itself.
And the societal role is also shifting. Religion isn't necessarily the glue holding society together anymore.
It seems not indispensable, certainly. While historically vital, the success of highly secular yet stable and prosperous societies like those in Scandinavia shows that ethical frameworks, social cohesion, and good governance can absolutely exist and thrive based on secular humanistic principles. It challenges the long-held claim that religion is necessary for morality and social order.
And morality itself seems more like an inherent human capacity.
The evidence points that way. Core moral intuitions related to fairness, empathy, and cooperation seem rooted in our evolutionary history and shared psychology, predating organized religion. Religions often tapped into and shaped these, but didn't solely create them. Secular ethics provides robust alternative foundations, and the way many believers engage with their own traditions, often using modern ethical reasoning, suggests a universal human moral sense at work. So the final assessment, based on this deep dive into the sources, the comprehensive evidence strongly supports the hypothesis of religions as primarily human-made cultural and psychological phenomena. Their narratives draw from myth, their doctrines from our minds, their persistence from social dynamics. While undeniably significant historically and personally, providing meaning, community, art, motivation for good deeds, their traditional claims to unique divine origin, empirical accuracy about the world, and indispensable moral authority face profound challenges from modern knowledge.
So when we talk about irrelevance, what does that really mean?
It mainly pertains to their diminishing role as authoritative sources of knowledge about the natural world and as the necessary foundation for ethics and social cooperation in our increasingly globalized, scientifically informed world. Their cultural, personal, and psychological importance might well continue for many, but clinging dogmatically to specific religious claims in the public sphere, especially when they conflict with science or human rights, can cause real harm.
The foundational claims look like products of human history, human ingenuity, human psychology.
That's what the convergence of evidence strongly suggests. And perhaps there's a different kind of awe and wonder to be found in the universe, revealed by science, posing a different kind of challenge. For humanity to find meaning, build community, and act ethically, using our capacities for reason, empathy, and cooperation, grounded in our shared human experience.
This has been an incredibly rich and, I think, challenging discussion, really weaving together so many different ways of understanding this core aspect of human life.
It really shows how taking a multidisciplinary approach can shed light on even the most complex and deeply felt aspects of our existence.
So as you, our listener, reflect on all of this, here's something to maybe chew on. If religion, at its deepest level, represents a powerful human attempt to find meaning, build community, and cope with the big questions of existence, how might we, individually and collectively, continue to foster those essential human needs in a world increasingly shaped by science and secular perspectives? What takes its place, or how do these needs get met now? Something to think about.